Welcome to the Peak Mental Performance Podcast with Joe Schillero, optimizing your mental health and athletic performance one episode at a time.
3, 2, 1, and we are live. So, Ben, thanks for joining me, man. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. So, I think it worked out really good timing of your last coaching post you called the clutch factor, and you talked about some of your mental strategies that you used, particularly in your recent win at the U.S. Open, and not just, I think there was a lot to be said for the fact that it wasn't just like, it went really well, here's the things I did right, but you talked a little bit about back in 2013, how some of the things you weren't doing back then and kind of how that led you down the path to where you're at now. So you talked a little bit about the Pro Raw Challenge and how you think you made some mental mistakes during that time that led you to sink more effort into that area. So can you talk a little bit about that, about the Pro Raw Challenge, you know, how that went and kind of what led you to start looking at some other strategies here?
Absolutely. And actually, I'd like to start a little bit before then.
Sure.
So the Pro Raw Challenge was in March, I think, of 2013. I've always been what my coach calls a very emotional lifter. And what he means by that is to perform at my best, I need a high level of psychological arousal. So like when you see guys in the gym who are snorting ammonia, getting trap slaps, like yelling, screaming, like that's the type of attitude that I need when I'm approaching a very heavy weight, like over 95%, let's say. And there are pros and cons to that. In contrast, my girlfriend is very much the opposite. You know, if she gets too psyched up, then, you know, she can't focus on her technique, and, you know, things kind of fall apart. So everyone is different. I would say for me, getting really psyched up can be a big difference, especially in the deadlift. It can easily be 30 or 40 pounds versus just going in there and what feels like going through the motions versus getting psyched up before I lift. And so headed into the meets that I had done before the Pro Raw Challenge, it wasn't really that big a deal for me because I didn't have a lot of expectations, but that was my first big meet. And so my coach had, told me, this is going to be a bigger stage. You need to be ready for kind of the different pressures that are going to be versus a local meet. And so I had practiced in the gym, training without getting psyched up. So trying to keep a very steady, stable mindset. And I had done pretty well at that. I had been able to adjust and not getting psyched up and still being able to lift pretty high percentages of my max weight. And then when I actually did get to that stage, the challenge is at the Arnold. So it's a big venue, lots of people there, lots going on. And, I kind of panicked a little bit, and I started feeling, those anxious feelings that you get whenever, really that you feel under pressure. So, sweaty palms, kind of, nervous feeling in my stomach, that type of thing. And the issue was that I hadn't trained, either physically or mentally to perform under those conditions. So I had practiced training, trying to be very calm, but all of a sudden I was no longer calm, right? I was anxious. So I hadn't practiced training psyched up. I hadn't practiced under any type of pressure circumstances. And so my performance really, really suffered as a result of that. And so I missed my opening squat badly. I missed my second squat. Somehow I managed to put it together for a third, but then I missed a bench and 2 deadlifts or something. It was a very bad meet. I think I went 4 for 9 or something. And so that was the point when I realized, hey, my mental game is really holding me back. I need to do something about
it. Yeah, that's really interesting you mentioned that. And I think something interesting, too, that a lot of people, I think, forget is how, you mentioned your girlfriend is a lot different in her approach. And I think sometimes people lose that. I feel like I see, and I still have a lot of improvements to make as a coach, but I feel like it's just like a common coaching error for people to try and just whatever they found worked maybe for somebody or for themselves, they just try and put it on the other person. So they'll, I know, and I'm sure so many athletes with some people need to get psyched up and that's their place. And some people, it just isn't clicking for them. And if they try and fake it, it doesn't work.
Absolutely. And there are pros and cons to both, right? I would say the cons of the approach that I take, getting very psyched up to lift, is that that's very draining, both physically and mentally. And so you can't train like that all the time. If you do, you'll burn out, or you'll get injured, or something bad will happen, right? Like you're not going to be able to make the slow and steady progress that you need. And so what I've learned to do over time is to incorporate light days in my training where really the weights aren't that much lower, but I avoid any type of pre-workout. I avoid any type of trying to get psyched up, any type of mental aggression. I just kind of go through the motions. And those days are very, very boring to me because I like to lift. Like that feeling of getting psyched up, of dominating the weights, like that's why I go to the gym. So I hate those days, but they're necessary because without them, I can't get the volume that I need to progress. And if I just try and do more volume and do it all at a very high level of psychological arousal, I'll kill myself. Right. And so that's kind of the balance that I found. And to your point, it's very important and also very difficult to know when you need to back off, when you need to go hard, both physically and mentally.
Yeah, definitely.
And to be honest, I wish I didn't have to get psyched up to that level because I think I could perform more consistently, and I think I'd get more volume in, which is very useful. But that's the way I've always trained. That's the way that seems to work for me. And most importantly, it's a way that I enjoy. So I'm not going to try and mess with it too much.
For sure. So after, you kind of came to the realization that you needed to address some of those things of dealing better with the big stage, being under pressure, how did you go about, I know you wrote about some of the strategies you've used, but before we get to the actual strategies, how did you go about figuring out what you needed to do?
That's a great question, because it's very easy, right, in hindsight, to be like, well, these are the things that worked, right?
Right.
So that's the thing that I use. But the truth was, it was a very messy and difficult process, probably more difficult than figuring out what worked for me in training. So the first thing that I did was kind of erase the idea of competition from my mind, because I was really discouraged after that raw meet. And so, I decided that I was going to go back in the gym and I was just going to lift for fun and I wasn't even going to think about competing. And I think I was in that mindset for a solid year. And it was very, very helpful for me to take that mental break from the idea that I need to constantly be pushing myself to be more and more competitive and better at competing. So that was kind of like the first thing. And that honestly was just kind of like a knee-jerk reaction to, hey, this meet sucked. I didn't have a good time at all. Like, I don't want to do it anymore. Excuse me. The next thing was really not something that I did. It's something that my coach did, Jacob Cloud. That I've worked with him for a very long time, and we're good friends. And so he has a very good feel for how I compete and also how I train. And he's worked with a lot of other lifters, so he has some ideas about how I can change those things to do better. And so I think it was the 2015 USAPL Raw Nationals was my first meet back. And I can't remember exactly when we started prepping for that meet, but it was about in June of that year, so a little over a year after the 2013 meet, that I started meditating regularly. And that had nothing to do with my actual training. That was just something that I wanted to try. I'd read that it had really great benefits. So I decided to start practicing, and I was pretty dedicated about it. And in the process, I kind of learned to calm myself down much quicker, and in much more high pressure situations than I had in the past. Just simple breathing meditation exercises I found very, very helpful. And so leading up to the 2015 Nationals, I was doing that up to the point where I was doing it for 20 or 30 minutes twice a day. So sometimes meditating for an hour a day. Not on anything in particular, but I'm just trying to get better at being able to stay calm and in the moment and kind of So what ended up happening at 2015 Nationals was kind of lucky. It was several things. The first was that I was in B flight, and so I wasn't up against any the highest level competition, right? The guys in the B flight were it was a huge meet, so there were a lot of flights, and so I wasn't competing directly against the top level performers, which made it easier for me to kind of stay calm. I wasn't comparing myself to them. The other thing was I did a pretty poor job of cutting weight for that meet, and I ended up just barely making it. And so I kind of got all my nerves out of the way before the meet started because I was so nervous that I wasn't going to make weight. They're sweating like hours before weigh-in. And I felt so terrible afterwards that there was no room in my brain to be concerned about my performance. It was just like, oh, I feel like shit. So even though it was a pretty good meet for me, and I think a lot of that was because I just wasn't that in my head about it, which is, a problem that I had a lot in the past. But I was happy with my performance. I finished second. I deadlifted 700 pounds for my first time in a competition, which was very briefly a record. And I set PRs across the board. So I was really happy with that performance, and that kind of helped me build momentum going into the next year. And what I found over the past few years is that momentum to me is very, very important for my mindset. If I feel like I'm consistently making progress, no matter how small, it's very easy to continue making progress versus trying to get out of a rut, right? And I think that's probably true for a lot of people. And so I competed once more. After that, I did the USPA Texas State meet. That was another great meet. And again, I had no expectations. It was a local meet. It was, very similar to my first big meet that I did, in that I was just going in to have fun. It wasn't a big venue, and that to me makes just a huge difference, that feeling. So I hit more PRs at that meet, and now, I feel like I have a little momentum going. And so it's kind of like almost cyclical. I got invited to Boss of Bosses that year, and now, again, I'm going up to the big stage, right? And I told myself at the time, I said, well, I've had a couple great meets. I don't have these mental issues anymore. It's not going to be a big deal. And so I didn't really focus on my mental game nearly as much, even as I had going into the Raw Nationals the year before. And that was a mistake, because at Boss of Bosses, again, all of a sudden you're on the big stage again. You're going up against some of the best guys in the world, Dan Green, Yuri, Belkin, Larry Wheels, all these huge names that I felt like I didn't belong. And so I got those same nervous feelings that I had at the 2013 Raw Nationals. And this time, I was a little bit more mature as a lifter, as a competitor. But I cut my opening squat so high. And whenever you miss an opener, it really gets in your head, right?
Yeah.
So it's fortunate that I had Jacob there. He knew that from my training I was capable of much more than whatever we opened at, which I think was 300 kilos. And so he called a very small jump to my second attempt, which is something that he doesn't usually do, but he was just trying to express confidence in me, right, so that I knew I could do it as well. So Boss of Bosses, I ended up squeaking out the win, which I was really happy about. But again, I kind of knew, okay, well, I got to get back on this mental game thing. And so I just went back to the meditation was really the thing I did. And that, again, same pattern, right? I found that when I was practicing it regularly and purposefully, right, with the idea that, okay, I'm doing this to become a better competitor, it was very, very helpful for me. By far the biggest single change that I've made. I did another local meet. I was trying to break Ed Cohn's record at 181, his deadlift record. Based on my training, I could have done it. And again, I had a great meet. Deadlift comes around, warm-ups are great, and then it's time to take this winning deadlift, like the 800 deadlift, and I panicked again. It's the same old story. So now I'm getting pretty frustrated. Eventually, I go and talk to a sports psychologist. His name's Dr. John Metzler. He works for the military here in Texas. So I had a session with him, and he gave me some very practical advice for how I could implement more things into my training that were, I'm trying to think of the right word to describe them. I'm going to use the word specific, might not be the best word, but for example, breathing exercises before a heavy lift, right? To both kind of get you back in that calm mindset, but then also to kind of differentiate the lift, a big lift from other lifts. And you may have, or people listening to this may have read about, having a ritual before you attempt a big lift, and it's kind of that idea. So that was one of the things that I implemented. There was really not a lot of trial and error. I found that the in general, the more focused I could be without thinking about the lift itself, if that makes sense. So the more in the moment, which is again is going back to the meditation, I seem to perform better. And so this has been a 2-year process that I've just described in a very meandering way. But the biggest thing was practicing both competing more, right? So practicing competition, and then practicing a calm mindset, both in training, in and outside of the gym.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of, I think the idea that you kind of mentioned of treating all these things as part of your training is a really important concept that I'm hoping people will start to think through when they listen to some of these episodes. I think especially for type A personality people, for a lot of athletes, it's very hard to think of psychological strategies as part of their training. It just feels like it's this thing off to the side somewhere that's, especially because so much of it originated in like Eastern philosophy and things like that. They're just kind of like, oh, that's just like that stuff. And it's like, no, it could be a concrete part of your training. And just like everything else in your training, like your work in the gym every week, your nutrition, if you are consistent with it, it can make a huge difference, And I think with the other thing I found interesting is, like you said, how you started meditating not necessarily to help your training, but then you found it ended up helping your training. I actually found the same for a lot of this mental strategies too. I originally started looking more into all this, psychological stuff just to improve my mental health with, anxiety and depression and stuff. And then kind of by accident, realized how much that stuff was helping my training, and my meets were going better and all these things. And it was crazy to see how then that started carrying over like concretely to training. So that was another part of the reason I wanted to start doing some of these episodes, is I'm like, whether you have, mental health issues or not, this stuff can really make a huge difference in your training.
Absolutely. It's made it's been one of the biggest changes I've ever made in my training. And by far the biggest change I've made in terms of my competition performances. And again, I'm a very my psychological mindset is very important to my lifting. So, it's not true for everybody. Some people, it might not matter what they're thinking. They're still able to perform. So I'm not saying it's like some type of holy grail, but for me, it pretty much was.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another, there's so many things that I think unpack from some of the things you learned through that journey. But I think one of the things, and you mentioned this in your coaching log, was the idea of training as preparation, not competition. And I think that is, to me, has been a huge part of my growth as a lifter and as a coach. And I think that seems to be one of the biggest things that, I don't know if you've noticed this too, that seems to differentiate people as they move from beginner, intermediate lifter to advanced, is if you can really put that into understanding and practice of training as preparation, of accumulating the work and chipping away, and it all being part of a bigger plan. And it seems like it's so hard to do, especially when you love training. But it seems like if you can get that concept, it makes such a huge difference.
That's what you have to do, because if you treat every training session like a competition, and trust me, I've done it, it doesn't work. You either burn out, or your progress is so slow and so sporadic that you can't figure out what actually is working and what's not working.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of moving through that whole journey you went through, and now you come to the U.S. Open, which, for those that, I think most people that are following powerlifting are aware of it, but for those that aren't, is a really one of the first opportunities that big prize money has been awarded again for powerlifting. You know, there was WPO years ago that was a very big stage for powerlifting. That went away, and there really hadn't been like a big money like best of the best meet quite like that had come up. There's been a few, so it was a kind of a big opportunity of a lot of very talented lifters were coming to it. And you know, if there was a competition to feel that big stage pressure, that's it when $40,000 is on the line. So what did how did your training look going into that meet? And how did you see some of those things you talked about feed into your performance on that day?
Training itself, like the lifts I was performing in the gym, I had already kind of figured out a plan. I stuck to the plan. I didn't really adjust that much at all. But my mental training I adjusted significantly. And so I started, training inside and outside of the gym. So inside the gym, I incorporated before all my heavy lifts, kind of those breathing exercises, the ritual before attempting something that was challenging, and practicing that regularly so that it became kind of, not muscle memory, but I guess memory. To the point where I could turn on and off the switch, right, whenever I needed to without any sort of external stimulus. I could just kind of put myself in a competition mindset, and I could get out of the competition mindset when I didn't need it. Then kind of outside the gym, I'm going to plug the Headspace app, which I have nothing to do with, but they recently came out with a series of meditations that were designed for athletes at the 2016 Olympics, I guess. And I just found them extraordinarily helpful because they're very targeted. I said before, I was just practicing on being mindful. These are very targeted on being mindful in the context of your training and your competition. And so I found those enormously helpful in terms of preparing myself for the competition, because one of the issues with visualization is a really big and often suggested way of preparing yourself for a competition. The problem with visualization is if you imagine yourself performing at your best, right, having the perfect day, then something goes wrong, you're kind of screwed because you've just visualized having this perfect day and now it's all falling apart. So, and obviously you don't want to envision, having a less than perfect day. And so this type of approach for me was much more helpful. And honestly, I think the thing I'm most proud about the US Open is my mindset the day of the competition, because I was just relaxed when I wanted to be relaxed. I was in the zone when I needed to be. And, even with some challenges that came up, particularly in my pec, which I'd injured before, I was worried about re-injuring. I was able to kind of overcome those when I know for a fact that in the past I would have crumbled under that pressure. And so I was really glad to see that I was kind of progressing as a competitor, as a lifter.
Yeah. It almost seems like visualization almost has to come. You almost have to use it with mindfulness if you're going to have it be effective. Because if you only use visualization, like you said, you kind of almost set yourself up for if things are perfect case scenario. But if you can use mindfulness too in less than ideal circumstances, it seems like you can couple the two together for being ready for anything.
There's some scholarly literature that suggests that if you're going to use visualization as a technique, you should visualize yourself responding to adversity, right? And so you can still visualize having a perfect day, but you're kind of accounting for the fact that things are going to go wrong in a competition, right? There's no such thing as a perfect day. So that's kind of one way to get around that. But I agree. I think using the two in conjunction is definitely a superior way to using visualization alone. Personally, I don't visualize at all anymore. I've kind of gotten away from that. I don't find it useful to me personally. And so I spend my time doing more of the mindfulness stuff.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you mentioned a couple really good mental strategies. You also mentioned the fact that you had reached out to a sports psychologist, which I think is another useful tool for people. For just the general lifter or athlete, obviously each individual situation has its own context, but what do you think is something generally that you see that most lifters could start doing right off the bat to see some improvements in their performance?
So the easiest thing I think is the breathing exercise, because there's a lot of literature behind this too that shows that kind of controlling your breathing will affect your performance in a beneficial way. So what I do is before I'm attempting a big lift, I don't think about it ahead of time. When I'm ready to get under the bar or approach the bar, I sit down, I close my eyes, take 5 deep breaths, breathe in for a count of 5, breathe out for a count of 5, and just repeat that 5 times. That's it. That alone can kind of help change your mindset and get rid of some of that anxiety, and it also physically prepares your body to perform at a higher level. Once you're kind of comfortable with that, I kind of like to remember the feeling of hitting a PR, right? So not exactly visualization, but kind of remembering how it feels to get that adrenaline rush, right? And so when I kind of incorporate that with the breathing, I find it's even more effective. But I mean, that's a super simple 20-second way, or I guess 25-second way, that you can kind of implement this into your training. You can see exactly how you respond to it, and it's 100% where I would recommend starting.
I agree 100%. I think meditation and breathing is just is huge. I would have never 10 years ago, and I never thought breathing exercises would be a regular part of my routine, and it's been a huge impact for me. And like you said, I think it's concrete and it's easy. You can do 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, 5 rounds, which for athletes is helpful to be able to look at something and be like, I'm going to do it this many times, and it's a little more concrete, I think. So I think that's helpful for people too. But yeah, man, I think you hit on some really good, impactful techniques that I think will be able to help a lot of people as they go moving forward with their own training. And I think something that I've talked about in some of the previous episodes here that I think they'll find with these things too is if you can implement some of those things, it will help you in your everyday life as well as your training and performance. And the two are so closely linked. It's a common misconception I think athletes and lifters have of, that they can focus on one and not the other. And it's like, it's not going to happen. Your body responds to stress too comprehensively for it to work that way. So I think these things for everyone listening, that whether you want to improve your general mental well-being and, kind of outside life and your training, I would definitely take some of these things very seriously.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's actually what kind of the next step of what I'm working on. So the one side of the coin is that absolutely, if you're stressed outside the gym, you're not going to be able to add stress to it in the gym by, prepping for a meet or something and expect everything to go perfectly. The other side is, and this is something I'm, just starting to work on. I've always thought kind of the opposite was true, right? If I can minimize the stress in my day-to-day life, then I can go much harder in the gym, right? I can save all that stress capacity for the gym. But it doesn't work that way either. If you're trying to minimize stress outside the gym, like that in itself is stressful. You have to kind of approach your training and your life in kind of the same way that you're going to make the most of what you got, right? And you're just going to kind of roll with the punches, for lack of a better term. But they go hand in hand, for better and for worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm interested to continue to see, your logs for people who haven't had a chance to read them are really good. And I think for people, if they jump on Elite FTS and look at, go under blogs, coaching logs, and then to Ben Pollack, it's really good information. I think it'll be interesting to keep seeing your development in that area too, because, we're all continuing to grow and learn things. And, I was just talking to Vincent DeCenzo yesterday about the same thing of as we're moving through all these challenges, we're learning techniques, we're learning things. And the goal of this, part of the goal of this podcast is that we're laying out a ton of different perspectives and tools, and then as people develop their own set of, philosophy or toolbox or whatever you want to frame it, that then they can pick and choose what will work for them. So I think the things that you have right now and the way you're explaining the teaching moments you're having are really helpful. So, I appreciate you taking the time to chat about these things, man. I think it'll be super helpful for a lot of people.
I hope so, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. So, all right, Ben, thanks for doing this, man. We'll have to, I think, chat more in the future. I think there's obviously a lot we could go into on all of these things, but I think for today, this was a really good introduction to some of those concepts from your perspective. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Happy. Thanks for having me on.